So, some of you have heard this story before. I began giving regularly to the church because my district superintendent guilted me into it. I went to see the Reverend Joyce Alfred because the North Prairie congregation with whom I was sharing ministry at the time was thinking about building a new building. And I knew that the amount that people were giving was not going to be anywhere close to the amount we would need to build a new church. So I naively went to ask Joyce how to get people to give more. Well, she looked me in the eye and asked how much I gave to the church on a regular basis. What was my weekly tithe? After hemming and hawing and shifting around in my chair, eventually I admitted that I did not make a regular offering to the church. And Joyce looked at me, and if you've ever had Joyce Alfred look at you, you just kind of wither inside. She looked at me and said, "Carly, you can't expect people to do what you're not willing to do yourself. Go home and take a look at your checking account ledger and your credit card statement. And when you do, you will see where you are giving your money, and you'll know what you really value, and you'll know what it is you really worship." So with my tail between my legs, I went home, and after several weeks of religiously avoiding my checking account ledger and my credit card statement, I finally looked. And then I looked again. And I realized an objective observer would look at my spending and figure I had absolutely no faith involvement whatsoever. Other than income, God had no place in my financial life at all. That was a humbling realization. So the next month I began tithing to the church, and I figured in for a penny, in for a pound, and began giving 10% off the top of each check. And I've said before that I discovered that tithing worked, that I've always had enough money when I tithed. What I've not said before is I knew giving regularly to the church would alleviate the guilt that I felt every week that came when I didn't support the church. And I knew giving regularly to the church would get my district superintendent, my boss, off my back. I did not know how much giving to God's work in the church would change my connection to God. I did not know how much giving regularly to the church would change my priorities, not just with money, but in everything. I didn't know giving regularly to the church would change my heart. Now, Zacchaeus was a tax collector. He was a Jewish man who made a very good living collecting tax money from other Jews to give to Rome. Now, working for Rome meant that Zacchaeus bowed down to Caesar, which meant working for Rome meant putting the living God somewhere else other than first in his life, so that Zacchaeus could worship the God of Roman values, namely money, power, and control. Now, we knew that Zacchaeus knew that Jesus was coming to his city, and he had watched his fellow tax collector, Matthew, turn from collecting taxes to following Jesus. And he had watched Matthew change from a despised member of society to a respected man. He had watched Matthew turn from a life of excess to a life of joy. In short, he had watched Matthew have a change of heart. So Zacchaeus climbed a tree to watch for Jesus as he walked through Jericho. And as we know, Jesus looked up at Zacchaeus and said, "Come down out of the tree, because we're going to eat at your house tonight." Now, we do not know what was said during that meal. But we do know that by the end of that time, by the end of the evening, Zacchaeus vowed to give half of his property to the poor. And he also vowed to pay back 4 times as much to everyone he had ever cheated, which meant everyone. So by the end of the meal, Zacchaeus made the decision to change his connection to money and to power, to control, and to Rome. And as a result, Zacchaeus changed his connection to God. He began using money as a tool to begin changing his heart. Perhaps you too have seen these commercials. Frightened, malnourished, and caged dogs and cats look at us pitifully through the camera. You've seen those? Yeah. And I hate them, by the way. And emotional music plays in the background, and the narrator says to us that we can change the lives of these poor, unfortunate critters if we will just contribute to this organization that cares for cats and dogs. I really, really detest these commercials because they tug at our emotions so that we will make a donation to their cause. We give money out of a purely emotional response to the pictures we see. And while the gift we make may change the life of one animal for a very short time, it in no way changes our lives. It doesn't change our hearts. And unfortunately, too often, the church does the same thing. We ask people to give out of an emotional response. We ask people to respond to what the church has done for us. We talk about a program near and dear to our hearts that needs our help. And we hope that that emotional tug will result in a life-changing experience. And then we all discover that emotional mountaintop moments really do not change our hearts because emotion is short-lived. Does everybody know what I'm talking about when I say a mountaintop experience?
Yeah.
I see a few people going, A mountaintop experience is like when a baby is born and you look at that new life and say, oh my goodness, God exists, God is real. Then you go home and change diapers. God leaves pretty quickly. Or you go up on a mountain, you see the beauty of creation, you say, oh my gosh, God does exist. Then you come back to take out the garbage. That moment goes away. That's a mountaintop experience. And we discover that mountaintop experiences are short-lived because the emotion is short-lived. We all get back to real life pretty soon. And as a result, we realize that a change of heart doesn't come through a mountaintop experience, maybe for a moment. But we discover that a real change of heart comes through a change in our behavior. Perhaps you've noticed that none of the speakers, and we've had several in worship during this stewardship month, have asked us to give our time, our abilities, and our money to the church as the result of an emotional appeal. I didn't shed a tear, which means none of you probably did either. Instead, each person talked about how giving their time, their abilities, and their money to the church changed their hearts. Each person talked about getting involved in a behavior that resulted in a change in their lives, a change in how they look at God and the world. You see, if we want to grow closer to God, we know we do that through study, prayer, and worship. But in my experience, no one has gotten involved in study, prayer, and worship without first giving God their time, abilities, and money. I've had people walk off the street and ask, do you have a Bible study? Well, yes, please come. Well, I want to learn more about God. They don't come. What I've observed is it's only when we all get involved in giving our time, our abilities, and our money to the church that we discover we want to know more about this God. A change in behavior results in a change of heart. And I will readily confess that I found prayer, study, and worship came much more easily once I changed how I used money. Because changing a behavior changed my heart, and changing my heart changed my priorities, and God started to come first in everything. Zacchaeus had a change of heart that began when he met Jesus. He had that emotional mountaintop experience. Now, we never hear from Zacchaeus again in the Bible or in history. So we don't know if he actually followed through with giving away his wealth. I hope he did. I hope he did change his behavior, because if he did follow through in giving to God's work with his money, I know he eventually followed through in giving with his time and his abilities as well. I know that if Zacchaeus changed his behavior, God changed his heart. See, I know if Zacchaeus actually did follow through with sharing his wealth. And let's face it, after Jesus left, he had to decide if he was really going to follow through with this, didn't he? Yeah, we don't know if he did. But if he did, I know he experienced what it was like to put God first. To have that moment of growing closer to God, to feel the joy and the peace that comes with giving God first place in your life. I know if he followed through, he began to experience a true change of heart. This is the week we've invited everyone to return their intention to give cards. And don't worry, if you forgot yours, we have more. And if you forgot this week, if you're not ready this week, well, we'll still be here next week. And the week after that. And eventually, if you continue to forget, well, I'll get in touch with you again. So, and know that an intention to give is just that. It's an intention. We know that life circumstances change. Sometimes we have an amazing windfall that we want to give as part of, to share as gratitude to God. We also know that sometimes jobs get lost. Someone gets ill, life circumstances change. So I hope every one of us decides to give generously and regularly to God's work through Lakeshore Church. And yes, because the church very much needs your support, but more than the needs of the church, I hope every one of us can find the deep-seated joy, the incredible peace of mind that comes with putting God first in how we use our money. I can honestly say, giving to the church regularly was a behavior that changed my heart. And if it changed mine, I know it can change all of ours. You see, I know how much giving would have done for Zacchaeus because I know how much it has done for me. Friends, God will change our hearts when we decide to give to God first. Amen.
Amen.
We have the opportunity